Week 9 fantasy football sleepers. We're talking about players that fall through the cracks but can help you win. We're talking about players that you can stream this week, and we're also talking about players that you can stash. For some of you, this video is like a waiver wire of the future. This podcast is like your way of finding a player you can add to your roster that you maybe beat the rest of your league to on the waiver wire when this player pops in like week 10, week 11. But for a lot of you, this is going to be a show where you find that player that goes right into your lineup. You're dealing with injuries. You got players on a bye week. Your team is a mess. You're looking for a spark. We're going to help you both. Players to stream, players to stash, fantasy football sleepers for week 9. And how do I determine who these players are? These players are all available in 70% of leagues or more. So this is not some sleeper show that's telling you to start somebody and go pick them up off the waivers when you were drafting them in August. You're in a competitive league. You need an edge. This is the show for you. If you want a show where people are calling like somebody who's like wide receiver 30, wide receiver 32, running back 25, a sleeper this week, then go for it. There's plenty of those out here. But for me, I'm looking to find an edge, and I'm looking to find you an edge as well. Let's get it started. Let's start right at the quarterback position. And quarterback's a fun one this week. There's a few players that we want to talk about and focus on. We got to start out with Jameis Winston, though. Jameis Winston is like, this is an amazing story. Jameis Winston takes over for Deshaun Watson. Deshaun Watson, all like the negativity there, the poor performances on the field. And then Winston comes in his very first game as starter in Cleveland, they beat the Baltimore Ravens. A huge win. They get their second win of the season. Cleveland was like in a tailspin. They go ahead and they beat Lamar Jackson, Derrick Henry, and like the unstoppable force that was the Baltimore Ravens. Ravens were on a massive win streak. And you get Jameis Winston with a 300-plus passing yard performance in his first game as starter. Deshaun Watson had no 300 passing yard games as Cleveland starter. So that's a huge one to begin with. Then you have the fact that Winston connected with Cedric Tillman on 2 touchdown passes, David Njoku on another. Nick Chubb is healthy. Elijah Moore is coming on a little bit. Like there's some spark to this Cleveland offense. So Cleveland, it was like addition by subtraction almost. Lose Deshaun Watson, spark with Jameis Winston, lose Amari Cooper, and young wide receivers are stepping up. This is a player that is a lock starter for you in Superflex, and he's on the streaming radar if he has another really strong game this week. Jameis Winston, my favorite player to discuss this week. The next quarterback we want to talk about is definitely a stash because he's probably not going to play this week. Drake Maye. Drake Maye is still in the concussion protocol, and he probably misses this week's game. But he's been a big-time fantasy contributor now for like 2.5 games. Finishes as a QB1 in his first start, the top 12 scorer at the position for the week. Finishes as a QB1 in his second start. And the second start was even better than the first. The interceptions went away, but the fantasy productivity in back-to-back weeks. Last week looked like it was going to be yet another fantasy-friendly performance. He had a 17-yard scramble for a touchdown where Maye looked like Josh Allen on the run. You can't call him Josh Allen, but we're going to say that run was Josh Allen-like. Now he's going to be banged up. So he's available to you in 88% of leagues. I want to stash Drake Maye for the stretch run, for those bye weeks, for when I need to spark down the stretch, because Drake Maye might really come on in the second half of the season. The third quarterback we want to really talk about is Joe Flacco. Joe Flacco, Anthony Richardson gets benched. Joe Flacco, new starter in Indy. Much like last season, Flacco is on a team with solid weapons, and Flacco, of course, is going to be a pocket passer, but the passing production might be very good. And there's sample size here, too. We've seen Flacco in like 2.5 games running this offense. And in each of those games, he finishes as the QB 15, the QB 4, and the QB 18. So he comes in relief duty, finishes as QB 15, QB 4 on the week, and then QB 18 on the week. So I think Flacco is set to be a mid-level QB2 for the rest of the season. And he has weapons there. Jonathan Taylor, fully healthy, puts pressure on the opposing defense every week. And then he's got Michael Pittman, who last year was fantastic. And the new wide receiver one in Indy is really Josh Downs. Josh Downs has 4 games this season with more than 15.5 PPR points. And in games with Flacco, he's been giving you like wide receiver one production. So there's a connection there between Flacco and the second-year wide receiver Josh Downs. Josh Downs was a guy, or if you were watching these videos, listening to the podcast earlier in the season, he was the guy we were begging you to add on the waiver wire and pick him up as a stash. So hopefully you had that. I know I have a lot of Josh Downs, really, really rooting for this. And the final quarterback to discuss, Russell Wilson. And Russell Wilson, of course, is a stash, but this is a valuable player for you to have in Superflex leagues. Wilson now has 2 starts as Pittsburgh Steelers quarterback, and in both of the games, he passes for 250-plus yards. The first game, the Jets game, was obviously a big-time fantasy-friendly performance. Game 2 against New York, not as much, but there could have been more. There was the non-touchdown, the looked like a touchdown, wasn't a touchdown for Pickens. So Wilson is pretty locked in here, and he is a starter for us in Superflex. If somebody drops him in your league, go ahead and grab him while he is on his bye. We're going to take a quick break. When we come back, we're going to talk about running backs, wide receivers, and tight ends, talking about your fantasy football sleepers, players to stream, and players for you to stash.
Hey, I know it's a popular statistic to cite, these underdog pick'ems, the vast majority of people go more than on any given player. Yeah, close to 80% of people, but that's because it's easier to find the shootouts than it is to find the dud games every Sunday afternoon. Like we knew week 5, Ravens-Bengals was going to be a shootout. And there goes Lamar Jackson for 4 touchdowns. There goes Joe Burrow for 5 touchdowns. Derrick Henry gets there. Zay Flowers is over 100 yards. Jamar Chase and T. Higgins both got there, as well as Chase Brown. Both Chases got there. You go more than. You 100x your payout on Underdog with their Pick 6 contest. But then you look at Dolphins Patriots, that's going down the toilet, right? Too bad Ramondre Stevenson at 18 fantasy points. But you improve your chances at positive returns when you correlate with these Underdog pick'ems. Use promo code Underworld. This is the biggest bonus Underdog has ever given out, up to $125. Promo code is Underworld. Put in $250, you get $125. Now go start picking.
Welcome back. We're talking about fantasy sleepers for week 9. I'm Theo Gremminger. Players for you to stash, players for you to stream, everything you need to get an edge on your league mates. And let's talk about the running back position. And if you watch my waiver wire show, you listen to my waiver wire podcast, you'll know that this was a running back group that I was not especially excited about this week. There's a lot of guys that are really stashes for you. Not a whole lot that are going to go into your starting lineup, but that's fine because all it takes is one injury and a guy misses some time and you've got a locked in fantasy starter. So we want to be a week ahead, especially this time of the year. Also, once you start getting into week 10, week 11, when you're preparing for the fantasy football playoffs, if you have a very strong team and you are looking to get a little bit of insurance, consider handcuffing as well. I know that's difficult for some of you in shallow formats, but handcuffing a potential James Cook with a Ray Davis, a Blake Corum, if you have a Kyron Williams, that can make a difference because guys nowadays don't always miss the season. Sometimes they miss 2 games, and having that handcuff that's like for like can really, really help you. Let's start out with the running backs this week. Ray Davis, available in 79% of leagues, just mentioned him. He's looking less like a handcuff plus and more like a true handcuff, but a very valuable one because of the way this Buffalo offense is able to churn out running back production. And you already saw it with Davis. Week 6, he had 150 plus combined yards, no fumbles, and he absorbed like 23 touches. And then in week 7, he scores a touchdown in garbage time. So he can play. James Cook really, really took over last week. There was really nothing to it. But Davis is still a contingent upside play for your bench, and he's available in a lot of leagues. Zeke Elliott, he's a touchdown or bust desperation play if Rico Dowdle is out this week. Isaac Guerendo. Guerendo is available still in 83% of leagues. Coming off his best game as a pro, and he should be rostered. If McCaffrey returns, Guerendo becomes an upside stash. If McCaffrey is unable to play, Guerendo can be a flex option. And of course, we know it's the bye week for the 49ers. So there's still a great deal of uncertainty. It sounds like McCaffrey is going to try to go, and sounds like he's ready for it. But there's always the potential for setbacks, and we just saw Guerendo play well. Blake Corum, available in 85% of leagues. Puka Nacua back, Cooper Kupp back. This makes this Rams offense one of the better ones in the NFL. So Blake Corum as the direct replacement for Kyren Williams becomes even more valuable with this offense trending up. Great player for you to stash. Blake Corum available in 85% of leagues. Same thing with Kimani Vidal, another rookie in LA, this time behind J.K. Dobbins. J.K. Dobbins getting a ton of work, but if Dobbins were to miss time, Kimani Vidal would be like a mid-level RB2 because he has two-way ability and he would absorb a ton of touches. Talking about Trey Benson. Trey Benson, similar to the other rookies, this is a stash that needs an injury. Benson's available to you in 84% of leagues. If James Conner were to miss time, Benson would be a valuable player for you to have on your roster. Justice Hill. If you're rostering Derrick Henry right now, you might want to pick up Hill because the Baltimore offense is so good and Henry's been so effective. But if they sit him for a game or two down the stretch, keep him fresh for the playoffs, Hill becomes interesting. This is a player we've seen catch a lot of passes. It's impossible to predict his strong weeks. Obviously, his usage would be very different than Derrick Henry, but he'd still be a guy in our starting lineup if Henry were to miss time. Deep sleeper for you deep leaguers out there, especially ones with like Saturday night waivers, maybe a Sunday morning waivers. Julius Chestnut, Tennessee Titans. Tony Pollard's status is up in the air. The Titans are in a complete tailspin. Tyjae Spears has already been ruled out. So I think we're going to see a lot of Julius Chestnut. This is a small college player, Sacred Heart running back. This is a guy that's been with the franchise for like 2 years. Do I think he's immensely talented? No. But do I think he could end up with more volume than we're giving him credit for? Yes. So volume is king. We've seen guys like Trey Sermon put up a solid week. Julius Chestnut, pick him up if you have a spot in a deep format. Another player for you to stash, Keaton Mitchell, available to you in 91% of leagues. Another great stash. All that good stuff I said about Justice Hill also applies to Keaton Mitchell. Keaton Mitchell, we saw him play very well last year. He had a 20-plus yard rush in every game he was healthy. And again, if Derrick Henry missed time, we mentioned like Justice Hill would be very different because Justice Hill is a guy that is never going to be like absorbing a ton of carries. Keaton Mitchell would mix in, and he's been very explosive as a runner and also showed he could catch the ball. So Keaton Mitchell, especially if you have an IR spot, really fun one. Ty Chandler, available in 79% of leagues. Contingent upside stash for Aaron Jones. Aaron Jones has just been dominating the Vikings offense. Jones averaging his most fantasy points per game since like 2020, playing very well. But if he were to go down, Ty Chandler would have value. Kenneth Gainwell, only if you have Saquon, might be the time to pick up some Gainwell just in case there's a game down the stretch. Philadelphia's offense is starting to come on. We saw Jalen Hurts find the end zone 3 times last week. Gainwell only for you super deep leaguers. And they're still not nearly the same usage as Barkley, but he would have some value to you if Barkley missed time. Jaylen Wright, available in 93% of leagues. Tua Tagovailoa is back, so there's like hope and optimism for the Miami Dolphins offense again. So we get back to the, hey, let's roster Jaylen Wright. He has 2 contingent upside scenarios. If Devon Achane misses time, if Raheem Mostert misses time, he'd have value. And then there's also a contingent, like with the beat writers, that think Jaylen Wright could end up just earning more work on the second half of the season. He's a solid player. We've already seen him rush for like 85 yards plus in a game. So we know he has it in him. It's just, does he get the opportunity? So he's absolutely a stash. Another stash for you is Marshawn Lloyd. Chris Brooks has passed Emmanuel Wilson by. So we're not really going to talk about Brooks. We're not going to talk about Wilson. We're going to talk about Marshawn Lloyd because I think when Marshawn Lloyd comes back, Green Bay has an upcoming bye week. So when Green Bay comes back from after their bye week, I think we could see Marshawn Lloyd back, and Marshawn Lloyd would immediately be the RB2 with a chance for like weekly touches. That's one to keep an eye on. I love stashing Marshawn Lloyd, and there's a lot of leagues where he's still IR eligible. Roschon Johnson. Roschon Johnson, direct replacement for DeAndre Swift. There's news today that Khalil Herbert has been allowed to find himself a trading partner. So we could see Khalil Herbert traded at the deadline, which makes Roschon Johnson even more valuable. He's already passed Khalil Herbert by, but it's just sort of like there's not even a number 3 back that would give them any sort of pause if there was an injury to DeAndre Swift. So you'd see a ton of Roschon. DeAndre Swift playing fantastic. DeAndre Swift also catching the football. We know Roschon has the ability to catch the football, and Juice is a runner. He's scored several touchdowns this year. And Khalil Herbert, if you want to play speculation, Khalil Herbert and Miles Sanders are your 2 speculation running backs. Do one of these 2 players get moved at the trade deadline and land in a better situation? Those would be the 2 that, if I had to guess, they would be the ones. Miles Sanders, Carolina, Khalil Herbert, Chicago. Those 2, the teams could make a move. They could end up going to a backfield that's in shambles in terms of being banged up, or just maybe an opportunity on a new team. So not really a necessity for you to stash those guys, but in deep leagues, you're always looking for a potential lottery ticket, and that is a potential not high-paying lottery ticket, but maybe like a $1 scratch-off that if you hit it, maybe you win like a couple of $100. There you go. Talking about the tight end position, not that many names, but actually a really intriguing list. So I only have 4 tight ends to talk about. The first one, the best one, if you need a streamer this week, is Mike Gesicki. And Mike Gesicki has now had 2 fantasy-friendly games this season. And both of these games have occurred with T. Higgins out. So in week 2, Gesicki gave you a 7-catch, 91 receiving yard line on 9 targets. And then last week, he had 7 catches for 73 yards on 8 targets. Higgins is likely to miss another week, so Gesicki can enter our lineup as a top 10 to 12 tight end. And he can also be used in a flex if you're in a pinch. It's sort of a weird, but it's a tight end filling in basically for a wide receiver in terms of absorbing targets. We'll talk about another Cincinnati wide receiver a little bit later on the show. Jonnu Smith. Jonnu Smith, like there was the whole notion was Jonnu Smith was getting all of these targets because Tua Tagovailoa wasn't there and like they couldn't do anything else. So these lesser quarterbacks were just going to throw right around the line of scrimmage and they'd hope for a little bit of yak with Jonnu. So Jonnu had all these targets. Then Tua comes back and he gets targeted 6 times again. So the production was not there last week, but the targets were there. So Jonnu Smith over the last 3 games has been targeted 21 times. He caught 16 of them. So I don't know if this is a trending up, but there are a lot worse tight ends for you to roster right now than Jonnu Smith when he's getting this sort of target total. 21 targets over his last 3 games combined. Brenton Strange. Here's one for you deep leaguers. Brenton Strange. And this is a little bit of galaxy braining, and this is a little bit me like self-scouting. But Brenton Strange is interesting because Brenton Strange was a 2nd-round pick in 2023. We saw him fill in for Evan Engram earlier in the year when Engram had the hamstring difficulties and missed time. And Brenton Strange last week, when Christian Kirk was injured, Brenton Strange ends up catching 5 passes, which was a season high for him. So could we see Jacksonville run 12 personnel a lot due to their limited wide receiver room? Strange could be helpful for you if you're in a tight end premium format. Adam Trautman. Trautman and Strange also available in 98% of leagues. Every tight end that I'm talking about today is available in 90% of leagues. Adam Trautman. Trautman is rostered in 0% of leagues, but this is a guy who is taking advantage of a situation in Denver. Greg Dulcich has been benched, and Lucas Kroll is banged up. It's a shoulder for Kroll. So Adam Trautman last week had his best game by far of the season. He had 4 catches for 85 yards and a touchdown. This week, Denver plays Baltimore. Baltimore has been generous to the tight end position. If you're like in a complete bind, then Adam Trautman's interesting. Baltimore is a bottom 8 defense against opposing tight ends. Okay, so that's really it for the tight ends. Again, it's Jonnu, Gesicki, Strange, and Trautman. This was an interesting week because I referenced that we're only talking about players available in 70% of leagues. These guys are all available in 90% of leagues. So tight end, an interesting spot this week. Wide receiver, the wide receiver position, I got some interesting ones to talk about this week. Really, actually, a fun list of sleepers. Some of these players you can put right in your lineup, but a lot of these players are like stashes that we want to stash for the rest of the season. Ricky Pearsall, available in 70% of leagues. Pearsall's a must stash. San Francisco's on bye, and we don't know what Pearsall is going to look like coming out of the bye. He only played 2 games so far in his NFL career, 7 catches in those 2 games, but he had that 39-yard rush. So he showed explosiveness on a per-touch basis. And this is a coaching staff that we trust is going to come out and make smart decisions. Again, McCaffrey might be back. There might be more mouths to feed, but getting Pearsall involved, he's an interesting player. I mean, talking about a first-round pick with athleticism. So I want to stash him where available, and he will be cut in a lot of leagues because people cannot afford to hold players through the bye. Xavier Legette and Jalen Coker. So Legette is available to you in 76% of leagues. Jalen Coker available to you in 94% of leagues. Both of these players are rookies. Legette's one we've known about for a long time. Well, you've known about both of them for a long time if you want to get real with it, if you're a player profiler, a longtime subscriber, because we were talking about Jalen Coker a lot last year as well. He was like an undrafted free agent, but we were intrigued by him athletically. He was a big-time producer at Holy Cross, and he was invited to the NFL Combine out of Holy Cross. And then we talked about him when he signed as an undrafted free agent, how there was going to be a potential opportunity. So we never thought it would be like this amplified, but we've been talking about Coker as well, if you watch Futurecast or Dynasty Life or any of our Dynasty programs. But Xavier Legette, available in 86% of leagues, and 76% of leagues, and Jalen Coker available in 94%. The pair of rookies, Legette we knew about because he's the first-round pick. This was like, of course, Legette's going to get more usage in the second half of the season. But then you have Jalen Coker, who's been showing promise over the last month as well. So you've got Legette, who's scored 3 touchdowns, and then you've got Coker, who's had 2 games with 68-plus receiving yardage in his last 4 games played. Both of these players are going to be on the field an absolute ton. Deontay Johnson is a Baltimore Raven, and Adam Thielen is going to miss again this week. So if you have the opportunity to pick up either of the Carolina rookies, go ahead and go for it. This could be one that pays off in the second half of the season. Staying at the wide receiver position, and we've got to stay with Carolina. And let's talk about Adam Thielen. Adam Thielen is an interesting one because I think there's a non-zero chance that he gets traded. I think that with the deadline coming up, Carolina's shown that they can be sellers. And if there was a team that maybe was going to trade for a Christian Kirk, maybe was going to trade for a Deontay Johnson, and they're looking for a veteran wide receiver, I think that Thielen might be interesting to people. And if he's not signed, he could come back and sort of ruin things for these rookie wide receivers. So keep an eye on Adam Thielen this week, and he could be an interesting player for you in the second half of the year. Jalen Tolbert. Jalen Tolbert has a solid floor. He's got 6 straight games with 3 catches or more. The problem is he's lacked high ceiling games. We had the big performance against Pittsburgh, and I got excited about that one. I thought we'd see a lot more Tolbert, and it's been very disappointing. So understand what you're getting with him. It's a floor play if you use Tolbert. And stashing him, there's not a whole lot of upside because Brandin Cooks is set to return soon. So Tolbert, floor play, he's available to you in 79% of leagues. Alec Pierce, we talked about Flacco earlier. Obviously, Josh Downs, obviously Michael Pittman are the 2 guys that are going to benefit the most. And Jonathan Taylor is going to benefit as well. But keep an eye on Alec Pierce. Keep an eye on Adonai Mitchell. Alec Pierce is the one where we've seen it with him and Flacco. And again, you're never going to get the volume with Pierce. But if you're looking for a boom bust flex and you are potentially an underdog and you need somebody to get a long touchdown, Alec Pierce is a good one because Minnesota has been especially generous to opposing wide receivers. And we've seen Alec Pierce put up a 3-catch, 134-yard touchdown game with Flacco earlier in the year. Dontayvion Wicks. Wicks has been a disappointing one because every time we get hyped about Wicks, it just sort of disappears, dies on the vine. Wicks, though, you can't completely ignore because we know he's got talent. We know he can catch touchdowns. He had a 6-target game a couple of weeks back and then kind of disappeared. It's just hard to predict. But if you want to stash, you want access to this Green Bay offense and a potential wide receiver injury, something opens up something down the stretch. Maybe you have Jordan Love rostered and you want a potential correlation play. Wicks is available to you in 71% of leagues. Talking about Parker Washington. Parker Washington made my top 10 waiver wire ads this week. So you can always go back and listen to Waiver Wired on the podcast over at Player Profiler, our podcast network, or you can watch it if you're watching this on YouTube. The Waiver Wire show is still up there. Waiver Wired, that people really like that one. And we go very deep, just like this show. But I talked about Parker Washington, 6th round pick out of Penn State in last year's draft. But this was a player that, like, when Jacksonville drafted him, it was looked at as a guy that people viewed as a value, a guy that some people thought could go much earlier, like a 4th round pick. Some people had him as a late day 2 possibility. So Washington coming out of Penn State ends up in Jacksonville, and now he looks like he's going to jump right into the Christian Kirk role. So last week we saw Washington catch 4 passes when Kirk went down, and this week you could see even greater usage for Washington. I have a league where I'm using Parker Washington this week. I'm not thrilled about it, but I think that I have a solid floor. I think he's going to see targets. You have the possibility that Brian Thomas misses as well this week, and Gabe Davis also dealing with an injury. So Washington could see a boost this week as a streamer, and I think he's also a stash because we'll see potentially if his role grows. Does he actually fill in the Christian Kirk role? So hopefully he's a guy you can add and see where it goes. But if you're in a bind, Parker Washington, I think, gets like 7-8 targets this week. Gabe Davis, I just mentioned Christian Kirk done for the season, creates a more consolidated wide receiver target tree. There's going to be Davis, Brian Thomas, and Washington with a lot of Evan Engram. That's sort of your passing game in Jacksonville. So Davis should see a slight boost. He's available in 84% of leagues. Michael Wilson, a player for you to stash, available in 85% of leagues. Don't use him this week against Chicago unless you're in a complete bind, but he remains a solid stash. He has a touchdown catch in 2 out of his last 3 games. Second-year player, was a 3rd-round draft pick. There's some pedigree there. Nothing special, but he can help you out in a bye week potentially. Elijah Moore. This one, along with the Carolina receivers and Ricky Pearsall, is my favorite one to talk about this week. Obviously, Parker Washington I like as well, but I think in terms of ceilings, Elijah Moore is there. He was a top 5 waiver wire ad for me this week. And again, my waiver wire, it's players available in 70% of leagues or more. So again, we're not talking about like a shallow league waiver wire top 5, but for deep leaguers, for leagues that are very competitive, Elijah Moore was a big time waiver wire ad this week. And this is a player that we've seen have success. In New York, his rookie year, he put up multiple big time weeks, was trending upwards, and then was drafted very, very highly during Garrett Wilson's rookie season. Obviously had a huge falling out with the organization, ends up in Cleveland, but this is not a player without talent. Was a 2nd-round draft pick out of Ole Miss, SEC pedigree, high draft capital guy. And now he's in a situation where over the past 2 weeks, he has 14 catches for 126 yards. And he had a 12 target game last week. So the Elijah Moore is very, very interesting. Staying at wide receiver, let's talk about Jermaine Burton. So Jermaine Burton's a really fun stash. Anybody who consumed my Dynasty content last offseason knew that I was really liked Jermaine Burton. This was a guy that coming out of Alabama, 3rd-round pick, but could have been a 2nd-round pick. This is one where certain teams crossed him off the list. There was like character concerns or whatever. This is not a guy who had like a massive off-the-field issue, but there were some teams that just didn't want any part of him. But at Alabama, this is a guy that had success, was transferred there from Georgia, ends up at Alabama, and he was a real deep threat with speed and really, really, really a solid deep threat. And we expected a little bit more this year, but the coaching staff liked Andre Yoshivas instead. So Andre Yoshivas has actually been playing poorly. So Jermaine Burton looks like he's starting to come on. He had a season high 40%. He was on the field 40% of the time. So snap share of like 40+% last week. He's an interesting one. I want to stash him and see where this goes. T. Higgins banged up, and we don't know what's going on with T. Higgins. Like T. Higgins, there's not a lot of clarity as to like when he's coming back, all this kind of stuff. It's not like he's an IR candidate, but there's contract stuff there where Higgins is going to probably be on a new team next year. So we don't know if Burton's one that couldn't, come on as the season progresses. So it makes for a very fun stash. And then the final player to stash, it's sort of like we talked about with Keaton Mitchell. This player is still IR eligible, Brandin Cooks. So Brandin Cooks should return from IR soon. But if you add him now, you could put him right in the IR slot if he's available on your waiver wire. And again, there's nothing about this Dallas Cowboys team where Brandin Cooks is going to struggle to come back and at least see what he was doing before. And they might give him a little bit of an increased look just to see if they can get a spark there, because it's all CeeDee Lamb, Jake Ferguson. They need another player. Tolbert has not been producing at a very high level, so we'll see what's going on. I'm Theo Gremminger. Make sure you subscribe to the podcast version of this, Sleepers, Streamers, and Stashes, available to you right at Player Profiler Podcast. You can also subscribe to it on its own if you don't want to hear all the other podcasts that I'm on, a couple of them. So I hope you subscribe to the main Player Profiler feed. And if you're watching this video on YouTube, please make sure that you're subscribed to our channel and you hit the like button. It helps us out a lot. All those little things help your fantasy football content creators that you like to consume. Let's crush it this week. The playoffs are right around the corner. It's November. Thanksgiving's going to be here before you know it. The season's going to wind down before you know it. It's time to get it. Let's get a W this weekend, and we'll see you back early next week with Waiver Wired.
Hey, I want to thank you for being part of this broadcast. If you have any thoughts on it, leave a comment. If you enjoyed it, make sure you leave a like. And if you want to see more shows on the Player Profiler channel, subscribe to it. That's how we know you want more.